Imagine facing an enemy so vast, so overwhelming, that defeat seems inevitable. Now picture doing it with just 300 soldiers, while your opponent's army numbers in the thousands. It sounds impossible, right? But that's exactly what happened in the story of Gideon. This is not just a tale of ancient warfare, it's a story of divine intervention, of how one man, who saw himself as the weakest of the weak, was chosen to lead an underdog army to a miraculous victory. You might be wondering, how could Gideon, with so few resources, achieve the impossible? Well, it wasn't about the numbers. It was about something much deeper: faith, courage, and the willingness to trust in a higher power when everything seemed stacked against him. But here's the part that will challenge everything you think about success and strategy. Gideon wasn't a natural-born leader. In fact, he was hiding in fear when God called him to lead Israel. His story is a reminder that you don't need to be perfect or fearless to do something extraordinary. So, if you've ever felt inadequate, like you weren't enough to tackle the challenges in your life, this story is for you. Gideon's victory didn't come from his strength. It came from a power far greater, and that same power can work in your life too, if you're willing to take the first step. Curious to know how this ordinary man achieved such an extraordinary feat? Keep reading, because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about how battles are won, both in life and on the battlefield. For 7 long years, Israel found itself caught in a painful cycle of sin and oppression, something that is more common than people might think. They were crushed under the weight of the Midianites, who mercilessly destroyed their crops and livestock, leaving the people with nothing. Picture this: every harvest season, the Midianites would swoop in like locusts, leaving behind only dust and despair. People were forced to hide in caves and cliffs, just to survive. It was a time of immense fear, where every day felt like a battle for mere existence. But here's something to think about. How often do we, too, find ourselves hiding, not in caves, but in the recesses of our own minds, fearing failure or uncertainty? The pattern of disobedience is something we can relate to on many levels. When things are going well, it's easy to forget what matters, isn't it? Israel did the same. They turned away from God, got comfortable, and then watched as their lives fell apart. It's human nature to avoid uncomfortable truths, but the consequences always catch up. Look around in your own life. What's a habit you know is dragging you down, but you haven't dealt with yet? For Israel, it was a slow decline into idolatry and sin, which eventually left them vulnerable to their enemies. Imagine the feeling of helplessness, knowing you could have avoided the situation but didn't. That's the weight they carried, and it's one we all know too well. But here's the thing: the worst moments often lead to the biggest transformations. In the same way Israel was oppressed, many of us face situations that force us into a corner. Maybe it's financial stress, a difficult relationship, or something personal that feels like it's taking over your life. Yet, it's in those moments, hiding in our proverbial caves, that change begins to take root. The question is, what will you do when the pressure mounts? Will you cave under the weight, or start preparing for your own breakthrough, just as Gideon's story will soon reveal? Gideon was not a man you would have expected to be chosen for greatness. He came from a humble background, part of a family that wasn't particularly notable. And yet, isn't that how it often goes? The people we least expect are the ones called to do extraordinary things. When God called Gideon, he greeted him with the words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." It's almost ironic, considering Gideon didn't feel mighty at all. In fact, he was filled with doubts, fear, and insecurities. He was threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding from the Midianites, trying to make ends meet. It's a vivid image of someone trying to survive, not thrive, in difficult times. Gideon's initial reaction to the angel's greeting was one of disbelief. He responded with a question that many of us have asked in tough situations. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? How relatable is that? When life gets tough, it's natural to wonder where God is. We see Gideon wrestling with that very human question, and it's in these moments of doubt that many people falter. But think about this. What if, like Gideon, the very thing that's breaking you down is the same thing that's preparing you for something greater? Often, it's through our doubts and fears that we are refined. God's response to Gideon's question wasn't a detailed explanation of why things had gone wrong. Instead, God called him to action. Go in the strength you have. There's a lesson in that for all of us. God didn't wait for Gideon to feel ready, and he doesn't wait for us to feel strong before calling us to step up. He tells us to act, even when we don't feel capable. What's something in your life that you've been waiting to feel ready for? Maybe it's time to move forward in that area, trusting that strength will come as you go. The way God calls us is often unexpected, and His timing doesn't always match our plans. Gideon was minding his own business, just trying to survive, when the call came. It's a reminder that we don't need to have everything figured out for God to use us. If anything, our weaknesses make us even more qualified in His eyes. Sometimes, we get so caught up in thinking we need to be perfect or prepared that we miss out on the opportunities placed right in front of us. Have you ever passed up an opportunity because you didn't feel ready? Gideon's fear and doubts didn't disqualify him from being used by God, and the same goes for us. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to feel scared. What matters is that you move forward in spite of those feelings. Gideon's story teaches us that it's not about being fearless, it's about being obedient. And when we obey, we find that God fills in the gaps where our strength falls short. It's a liberating realization, really. You don't have to have it all together. You just have to be willing. There's also a powerful message in how God addresses Gideon, not as he saw himself, but as God saw him. Mighty warrior wasn't how Gideon felt, but it was his true identity in God's eyes. This is a reminder for all of us. We often define ourselves by our limitations, but God sees our potential. The challenge is learning to see ourselves as He sees us. What would change in your life if you started viewing yourself through that lens? It's easy to see yourself as small or insignificant, especially when life's challenges seem overwhelming. Gideon saw himself that way, the least in my family, he said. But God doesn't call us based on how the world ranks us. He sees something in us that we often overlook. Maybe today is a good day to start asking yourself, what does God see in me? The answer might surprise you, just as it surprised Gideon. And then there's the fear of failure. Gideon's fear was palpable, but it didn't stop him from being used. Fear is not a sign that you aren't ready. It's often a sign that you're on the verge of something important. Many people wait for the fear to pass before they take action, but the truth is, action is what diminishes fear. Gideon moved forward despite his fear, and in doing so, he found that God had been with him all along. What fear is holding you back today? By the end of this encounter, Gideon's perspective had shifted, but he still had much to learn. Just like Gideon, we may not fully understand the path ahead, but the call remains. Go in the strength you have. That's a powerful directive for all of us. Maybe the strength you have today doesn't feel like enough, but if you start moving, you'll find that it grows. Trust that the calling on your life is bigger than your fear. The story of Gideon is just beginning, and so is yours. Even after God's direct call, Gideon was still hesitant. He wasn't convinced that he could lead Israel, and it's easy to see why. His doubts weren't just about himself, but also about God's presence in his life. Gideon wanted proof that he hadn't imagined the whole thing, which leads us to one of the most relatable aspects of his story: asking for signs. How many times have you been unsure about a decision and wished for some kind of sign to guide you? Gideon, in his uncertainty, boldly asked for 2 miraculous signs involving a wool fleece. It's almost comforting to know that even a future leader of Israel needed reassurance, isn't it? Gideon's first request was simple but bold. He asked God to make the fleece wet with dew while keeping the ground around it dry. This wasn't just a casual ask. For Gideon, it was his way of testing whether God was truly with him. When the fleece was soaked with dew and the ground was dry, Gideon had his sign, but still, he wasn't entirely convinced. Now, this is where things get interesting. Gideon asked for a second sign, this time reversing the conditions. Let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it was soaked with dew. Think about it. Gideon wasn't satisfied with just one miracle. How often do we, too, ask for multiple confirmations before we feel secure enough to move forward? It's human nature to want certainty. Gideon, despite having direct communication with God, still doubted. It's a profound reminder that faith doesn't always mean the absence of doubt. In fact, doubt often coexists with faith. Gideon wasn't being rebellious or disobedient in asking for these signs. He was simply trying to find the courage to step into a role that seemed far beyond him. We can see ourselves in this, can't we? Before taking a leap of faith, we often want that extra confirmation. But here's the truth. Sometimes, the signs are already there, we just have to act on them. What Gideon did was not uncommon. Many of us do the same in our own way. We might ask for clarity in different forms, whether it's through people, circumstances, or even subtle signs. And when we don't get them, we often hesitate, questioning whether we're truly on the right path. But what if the real test isn't in the signs we ask for, but in our willingness to move forward when we don't get all the answers we're looking for? Gideon teaches us that while signs can confirm our path, they aren't the source of our strength. God is. There's also a deeper layer to Gideon's request for signs. It's not just about confirming God's presence. It's about confirming his own role in the story. Gideon needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was the one chosen to lead. This speaks to a common struggle we all face, feeling unworthy or inadequate for the tasks ahead of us. How often have you questioned whether you're the right person for the job, whether it's in your career, your relationships, or even your personal goals? Gideon's story reminds us that it's okay to seek reassurance, but it also challenges us to recognize the signs when they come. The story of the fleece also highlights an important truth. God is patient with us. Gideon's hesitation didn't frustrate or anger God. Instead, God responded to each of his requests, understanding the fear that held him back. This shows that our doubts don't disqualify us from being used by God. Even when we hesitate, God remains faithful. What does this tell us about the nature of God's calling on our lives? It's not based on perfection, but on His grace and understanding. Gideon wasn't a flawless leader, but he was faithful, and that made all the difference. It's fascinating to consider the symbolism of the fleece. The wet fleece surrounded by dry ground, and then the dry fleece surrounded by wet ground, can be seen as metaphors for Gideon's internal struggle. At times, we feel isolated, dry, and alone in our challenges while everything around us seems to thrive. Other times, we are overwhelmed by blessings while others seem untouched. These moments of contrast can either strengthen our faith or deepen our doubt, depending on how we choose to interpret them. For Gideon, these signs were a turning point. What signs are you currently facing in your life, and how are you interpreting them? As Gideon moved forward, the signs gave him the confidence he needed to accept his calling. Yet, it's important to recognize that the signs didn't change who Gideon was. They only confirmed what God had already spoken over his life. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. We often look to external signs to validate our worth, but the truth is, our identity is already established in God's eyes. The signs might encourage us, but they don't define us. What defines us is the purpose God has placed in our hearts, whether we feel ready for it or not. Gideon's hesitation didn't disappear overnight. Even after receiving the signs, he would continue to face moments of doubt and fear. But each step forward, each act of obedience, brought him closer to fulfilling his destiny. The same is true for us. We may not feel ready, but every time we act in faith, we move closer to becoming the person we were meant to be. The story of Gideon is one of transformation, from a hesitant, fearful man to a mighty warrior. What transformation is waiting for you on the other side of your hesitation? By the time Gideon received his signs, he was ready to take the next step. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Like any journey of faith, it would require him to trust in God more than in his own abilities. And that's where the true test of faith comes in, not in the asking for signs, but in the willingness to follow through once the signs are given. What will you do when you've received the confirmation you've been waiting for? Gideon started with an army of 32,000 men, a decent-sized force for battle. But God had other plans. He told Gideon that the army was too large. Now, this seems counterintuitive, right? When we think of success, we often associate it with strength in numbers, whether it's a team at work, a project group, or even the number of resources we have. But God wanted to make it clear that this victory wasn't going to come from military might or human strength. It would come from Him. So, He gave Gideon a shocking command: reduce the army. The first reduction was straightforward. God instructed Gideon to tell the men that anyone who was afraid could leave. Just like that, 22,000 men walked away, leaving only 10,000. Imagine being in Gideon's shoes at that moment. He had already been hesitant about leading this army, and now 2/3 of his men were gone. But here's the thing, this reduction wasn't just about numbers. It was a lesson in trust. Gideon had to trust that God's plan, no matter how strange or risky it seemed, was the best path forward. How many times have you felt like the odds were stacked against you, only to realize later that the situation was preparing you for something greater. Even after the first reduction, God wasn't done. He told Gideon that 10,000 men were still too many. Think about that. 10,000 men against a vast Midianite army already seemed like an uphill battle, but God had a specific purpose in mind. He wanted Israel to understand that their victory would come from him alone. So, he gave Gideon another command. This time, the men were tested by how they drank water from a stream. Only 300 men passed the test. Out of 32,000 soldiers, only 300 remained. It's hard to imagine the thoughts running through Gideon's mind at that moment. This story isn't just about reducing numbers. It's about reducing reliance on our own strength. Gideon's situation mirrors moments in our lives where we feel like we don't have enough, whether it's time, resources, or support. But often, God allows those reductions to happen so that we can learn to rely fully on Him. Maybe there's something in your life that feels like it's been reduced, but instead of seeing it as a loss, consider that it might be an opportunity for something greater. The story of Gideon teaches us that sometimes less is more when it comes to accomplishing great things. The image of 300 men standing against an army that vastly outnumbered them is powerful. It challenges our conventional understanding of success. We often believe that the bigger, stronger, or wealthier we are, the more likely we are to succeed. But God turns that idea upside down. Gideon's army of 300 wasn't the strongest or most experienced, but they were the ones God had chosen. It's a reminder that God's criteria for success are different from ours. What area of your life could benefit from trusting less in numbers and more in God's plan? God reducing Gideon's army to 300 men also speaks to the idea of quality over quantity. These 300 men were tested and proven to be ready for the battle ahead. In our own lives, we sometimes hold on to things or people that aren't really contributing to our growth or success. What would happen if you focused on quality? Whether it's the relationships you nurture, the work you invest in, or the way you spend your time. Gideon's army wasn't large, but it was effective because it was the right 300. Maybe the next step in your journey involves evaluating what's truly necessary and letting go of what isn't. There's also a deeper message about faith in action here. The 300 men who remained weren't just any soldiers. They were the ones who stayed when others left. These were the men who were ready to fight, even when the odds were against them. Faith isn't just about believing in something. It's about being willing to act on that belief, even when it doesn't make sense. Gideon's army shows us that real faith isn't passive, it's active, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. What's an area of your life where you need to act on your faith, even if it seems illogical or risky? Gideon's army reduction is also a powerful illustration of God's desire for us to depend on Him fully. Often, we're tempted to rely on our own strength, resources, or abilities, but Gideon's story shows that true success comes from trusting in God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense to us. The 300 men who remained didn't win the battle because of their skill or strategy. They won because God was with them. This is a reminder that when God is on your side, even the most impossible situations can lead to victory. What would happen if you stopped relying so much on your own abilities and started trusting more in God's guidance? Gideon's story is also a challenge to the idea that bigger is always better. We live in a culture that glorifies size, whether it's big businesses, big houses, or big followings. But Gideon's army of 300 teaches us that sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest, most unexpected places. This is a lesson in humility and perspective. It's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of more, but Gideon's army shows us that less can often be more impactful when God is involved. What if you started seeing the small things in your life as opportunities for big breakthroughs? Finally, the reduction of Gideon's army highlights the power of obedience. Gideon didn't understand why God was reducing his army, but he obeyed anyway. This is a crucial part of his story, and ours. Obedience, even when it doesn't make sense, is a key factor in experiencing God's blessings. Sometimes, the steps God asks us to take don't align with our logic or expectations, but they are always part of His bigger plan. Gideon's obedience in reducing his army led to one of the most extraordinary victories in Israel's history. What step of obedience is God asking you to take today, even if it seems counterintuitive? As Gideon prepared for battle with his 300 men, the stage was set for one of the most incredible moments in his journey. What seemed like a disadvantage was actually part of God's divine strategy. The question now is, How would Gideon's small but mighty army approach the battle ahead? With only 300 men left, Gideon's next challenge was to develop a battle plan. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. Rather than relying on traditional weapons of war, God instructed Gideon to arm his men with trumpets, empty jars, and torches. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Imagine being one of those 300 soldiers, preparing for battle, only to be handed a trumpet and a jar instead of a sword. Yet, this unconventional strategy was exactly what God intended, and it's a powerful reminder that God's ways are not our ways. Sometimes, the solutions we are given in life don't make sense at first glance, but they are part of a much bigger plan. As night fell, Gideon's 300 men split into 3 groups and surrounded the Midianite camp. At Gideon's signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed the jars, and waved their torches. The sudden noise and chaos threw the Midianites into a panic. They awoke in confusion, thinking they were under attack by a massive army. What followed was pure chaos. The Midianites, in their confusion, turned on each other, attacking their own soldiers. The strategy worked, and the Midianites fled in fear. This victory was not achieved through strength or numbers, but through divine intervention and an unconventional approach. It's a striking lesson for all of us. Sometimes, success comes from doing things differently, from thinking outside the box. This part of Gideon's story also highlights the power of psychological warfare. The Midianites didn't lose the battle because of superior force. They lost because of fear and confusion. This can be applied to many areas of life, where the real battle isn't always physical or external, but mental. How often do we allow fear and confusion to defeat us before we even start? Gideon's army teaches us that confidence and strategy, even when unconventional, can overcome what seems like insurmountable odds. The next time you face a challenge, consider whether the battle you're fighting is more in your mind than in reality. Sometimes, a shift in perspective is all it takes to turn things around. It's also worth noting how Gideon's men followed his instructions to the letter. There was no hesitation or questioning, despite the strange battle plan. This speaks to the importance of unity and trust in leadership. Gideon's men trusted him and trusted that the plan, no matter how unconventional, would work because it was guided by God. In life, we often need to trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Whether it's in business, relationships, or personal growth, sometimes following the plan requires faith in something bigger than ourselves. What plan are you hesitant to follow today because it doesn't seem logical? Maybe it's time to trust that there's a reason behind it. Gideon's victory wasn't just a military win, it was a spiritual one. The battle plan was designed to demonstrate God's power and to show Israel that their success came from Him, not their own strength. This is a reminder that when we face our own battles, we need to recognize the source of our strength. It's easy to rely on our own abilities or resources, but true success often comes from surrendering to a higher power. What would change in your life if you stopped relying solely on your own strength and started trusting more in God's plan? The torches, trumpets, and jars used in this battle also have symbolic meanings. The torches represented light, a beacon of hope and truth in the midst of darkness. The trumpets signaled victory, a proclamation of triumph before the battle was even fully won. And the broken jars? They remind us that sometimes we have to break something, whether it's a mindset, a habit, or a fear, in order to see the light shine through. What needs to be broken in your life today so that victory can come? The aftermath of the battle was just as important as the victory itself. Gideon and his men didn't stop with the initial victory. They pursued the fleeing Midianites, ensuring that the enemy wouldn't return to threaten Israel again. This teaches us the importance of follow-through. It's not enough to win the battle, we must also secure the victory. In life, it's easy to stop once we achieve a certain level of success, but true progress comes from persistence. What areas of your life require more follow-through to secure the success you've been working towards? This victory also marked a turning point for Israel. The fear and oppression they had lived under for 7 years were finally lifted. But it wasn't just about military freedom. It was a spiritual breakthrough as well. Israel was reminded of God's faithfulness and His power to deliver them, even when the odds were against them. For Gideon, it was a moment of validation, proof that despite his doubts and fears, he was indeed called by God for this purpose. It's a powerful lesson for anyone who feels unworthy or unsure of their path. Sometimes, it takes stepping into the battle to realize that you were equipped for it all along. There's also a leadership lesson in how Gideon handled this victory. He didn't take credit for the win, even though he had led the charge. He understood that this was God's victory, not his. In life, we often struggle with taking too much credit for our successes or, conversely, not giving ourselves enough credit when we've worked hard. Gideon shows us the balance. Recognize the role you've played, but always give credit to the one who empowered you. How can you apply this kind of humility in your own victories? The story of Gideon's battle doesn't end with this victory. It's merely a chapter in a larger narrative about faith, leadership, and trust. As Gideon and his 300 men chased down the remaining Midianites, the question remained, how would they handle the next challenge? What would come after this hard-fought victory? After the dramatic victory over the Midianites, Gideon and his 300 men didn't rest. They pursued the fleeing Midianite leaders, Zebah and Zalmunna, determined to finish the job. This phase of the story teaches us a critical lesson. Victory often requires persistence beyond the initial breakthrough. It's easy to celebrate too soon, but Gideon knew the battle wasn't truly over until the enemy was fully defeated. In our own lives, we often experience small victories, but the key to lasting success is in the follow-through. What's something in your life that needs pursuing, even after the first signs of success? As Gideon and his men chased the Midianite kings, they encountered a surprising challenge. Not from their enemies, but from their own people. The men of Sukkos and Penuel, fellow Israelites, refused to provide food for Gideon's army. These were supposed to be allies, but instead of supporting Gideon, they doubted his chances of success. How often do we face resistance from those we expect to be on our side? Sometimes, the biggest challenges come from within our own circles, and this can be more disheartening than opposition from enemies. Gideon's story reminds us that persistence is necessary, even when those around us doubt our mission. Gideon's response to the men of Sukkos and Penuel was firm. He didn't let their lack of support derail his mission. Instead, he pressed on, knowing that his calling wasn't dependent on their approval or help. This is a powerful lesson in leadership and focus. When we're on a mission, there will always be detractors, people who don't believe in what we're doing. But like Gideon, we must stay focused on the goal and not be swayed by others' doubts. What's something in your life that you're pursuing, despite the lack of support from those around you? The pursuit of Zebah and Zalmunna also highlights the importance of endurance. Gideon's men were tired and hungry, yet they continued the chase. They knew that if they didn't capture the Midianite leaders, the threat would return. This speaks to the importance of finishing what we start, even when we're exhausted. In today's world, it's easy to give up when things get tough, but true victory often requires pushing through when we feel like we have nothing left to give. Where in your life do you need to find the strength to keep going, even when it feels like you've already given all you have? When Gideon finally captured Zebah and Zalmunna, it was a moment of triumph, but it wasn't without its costs. The journey had been long, and the challenges had been numerous. This part of the story reminds us that victory often comes at a price. There's effort, sacrifice, and perseverance involved in any significant achievement. For Gideon, the capture of these kings was the culmination of a mission that had started with fear and doubt but ended in success. For us, it's a reminder that every journey has its challenges, but those challenges shape us into the people we need to become. Gideon's pursuit of these kings wasn't just about military victory. It was about ensuring long-term peace for Israel. By capturing Zebah and Zalmunna, he eliminated the threat of future attacks from the Midianites. This is a crucial point. Sometimes, the battles we fight aren't just about the present moment. They're about securing a better future. Gideon's persistence ensured that Israel wouldn't have to face the same enemies again. What long-term victories are you working toward today? How are you setting yourself up for peace in the future, not just short-term success? Another key aspect of this pursuit is how Gideon handled opposition from within. When he returned victorious, he dealt with the men of Sukkos and Penuel, who had refused to help him. His response was decisive, but also just. Gideon's actions here show us that leadership isn't just about winning battles, it's about holding people accountable. Sometimes, part of our journey involves dealing with those who didn't believe in us or support us along the way. But like Gideon, we need to handle these situations with wisdom and fairness, ensuring that justice is served without letting bitterness take root. This pursuit also reveals something deeper about Gideon's character. Throughout the chase, Gideon remained focused on the mission, not letting personal grievances or exhaustion distract him. It's a lesson in staying mission-minded, even when the journey gets tough. We often start strong, but the real test comes when things get difficult. Gideon's persistence in capturing the Midianite kings is a reminder that the true measure of success is not just in the beginning, but in how we finish. What mission in your life requires that kind of focus and persistence? The journey to capture Zebah and Zalmunna wasn't just about external battles. It was also an internal test for Gideon. He had to stay strong, lead his men, and keep his focus despite numerous challenges. In many ways, this mirrors the internal battles we all face, fighting doubt, fatigue, and resistance along the way. Gideon's story teaches us that persistence isn't just about enduring physical challenges. It's about mastering the internal struggles that threaten to derail us. How can you strengthen your resolve today, not just in external circumstances, but in your internal mindset? As Gideon and his men finally defeated Zebah and Zalmunna, the chapter of their pursuit came to a close. But with victory comes new challenges. How would Gideon handle the next phase of leadership? What would be the consequences of his choices moving forward? The story was far from over. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon found himself in a position of great influence. The people of Israel, having witnessed the incredible victory, wanted to make him their king. This was a pivotal moment in Gideon's leadership journey, and it speaks to a common experience in life. Success often brings new challenges, particularly in the form of power and influence. But here's where Gideon's humility shines through. He refused the offer of kingship, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." This was a profound statement, a reminder that true leadership is about service, not power. Gideon understood that the victory belonged to God, and he didn't want to take credit for something that was never his to begin with. However, Gideon's story doesn't end on this high note. While he rightly refused to become king, he made a critical mistake that would have long-lasting consequences. He asked the Israelites for a portion of their plundered gold and used it to create an ephod, a religious garment. His intentions may have been good. Perhaps he wanted to commemorate the victory or create a symbol of Israel's deliverance. But this ephod became a snare for Israel. The people began to worship it, and it led them into idolatry. This is a powerful lesson about the unintended consequences of our actions, even when we have the best intentions. Sometimes, what starts as a good idea can spiral into something harmful if we're not careful. Gideon's leadership mistake with the ephod reminds us of the delicate balance between success and responsibility. After a victory, it's easy to make decisions that seem right in the moment but have unforeseen consequences. Gideon, who had just led Israel to freedom, now inadvertently led them into spiritual bondage. This shows us that even great leaders are flawed, and it's a reminder that we need to constantly seek wisdom in our decisions, especially when we're in positions of influence. What decisions in your life need a closer look to ensure they don't lead to unintended consequences? This part of Gideon's story also illustrates the dangers of success. When we achieve something great, there's often a temptation to let our guard down, to think that we've made it and no longer need to be vigilant. But Gideon's mistake shows us that success can be just as dangerous as failure, if not more so. After all, it was in his moment of triumph that he made a decision that would lead Israel astray. How often do we, after reaching a goal, become complacent or make choices that don't align with our values? Gideon's story is a cautionary tale about staying grounded and humble, even in success. There's also a powerful lesson here about legacy. Gideon's leadership had brought 40 years of peace to Israel, but the idolatry sparked by the ephod marred his legacy. It's a reminder that our actions have long-lasting impacts, not just in our lifetimes but for generations to come. We often think about legacy in terms of achievements, but Gideon's story shows us that our mistakes can also become part of our legacy. What kind of legacy are you building today? Are there areas in your life where you need to course-correct to ensure that your legacy is one of integrity and faithfulness? Despite his mistake, Gideon remained a leader who was chosen and used by God. This is an encouraging reminder that even when we mess up, God doesn't abandon us. Gideon's mistake with the ephod didn't negate the fact that he was a mighty warrior who delivered Israel. It's easy to let our mistakes define us, but Gideon's story shows us that we are more than our failures. God's grace is greater than our shortcomings, and He can still use us, even when we stumble. What mistakes are you holding on to that you need to let go of, trusting that they don't define who you are? The ephod incident also highlights the importance of accountability. Gideon, in his position of leadership, may not have had anyone to question or challenge his decision. This is a common problem for leaders. When you're at the top, it's easy to make decisions without input from others, and that's when mistakes can happen. Gideon's story reminds us that no matter how successful or powerful we become, we need people in our lives who can hold us accountable, who can offer wisdom and perspective. Who in your life is helping you stay accountable, especially in your moments of success? Gideon's leadership, while flawed, was still a powerful example of humility. He refused kingship and acknowledged God as the true ruler of Israel. This humility is something we can all aspire to, especially in a world that often values power and recognition over service and integrity. Gideon's refusal to become king shows us that true leadership isn't about titles or authority. It's about serving others and pointing them to something greater than ourselves. How can you practice humility in your own leadership, whether in your career, your family, or your community? The story of Gideon's leadership is also a reminder that leadership is not about perfection. Gideon made mistakes, but he was still used by God to bring deliverance to Israel. This is an important lesson for anyone who feels the weight of leadership. We often feel pressure to be perfect, to never make a wrong move. But Gideon's story shows us that leadership is about faithfulness, not flawlessness. It's about continuing to lead, even when we make mistakes, trusting that God's grace is sufficient. How can you lead with faithfulness, even when you don't have all the answers or when you've made mistakes? As Gideon's time as a leader drew to a close, Israel entered a period of peace. But the ephod and the idolatry it inspired would have long-lasting effects. Gideon's story leaves us with a sobering question. How will we handle the success and influence we've been given? Will we use it to serve others and honor God, or will we make decisions that, even unintentionally, lead people astray? The end of Gideon's leadership was bittersweet, marked by peace, but also by the seeds of future problems. How will you navigate the challenges of leadership and success, ensuring that your actions lead to long-term growth, not short-term mistakes? Gideon's leadership may have brought 40 years of peace, but what would happen after his death? Would the people of Israel remain faithful, or would they fall back into the same patterns of disobedience and idolatry? After Gideon's death, the peace he had fought so hard to secure for Israel began to unravel. Despite the 40 years of tranquility during his leadership, Israel quickly fell back into old habits of idolatry and disobedience. It's a stark reminder of how fragile progress can be when it's not deeply rooted. Gideon's story shows us that even after victories, we must remain vigilant, because the temptation to return to old patterns is always lurking. How often do we see this in our own lives? We work hard to make changes, but without constant attention, we can easily slip back into the same behaviors we thought we had left behind. The people of Israel, once again, turned to Baal worship, forgetting the God who had delivered them from the Midianites. This cycle of disobedience is something we see not only in the Bible but also in our everyday lives. When things are going well, it's easy to forget the source of our success. We start to rely on ourselves or on things that give us temporary satisfaction, just as the Israelites did. But just like them, we often find that those things lead us back into trouble. What is it in your life that you tend to turn to when things are going well, only to realize later that it's pulling you away from what really matters? Gideon's death marked the end of an era of peace, but it also highlighted the importance of lasting spiritual foundations. While Gideon had led Israel to freedom, the people's hearts hadn't fully changed. They followed God as long as Gideon was alive to lead them, but after his death, they quickly returned to their old ways. This shows us that true transformation isn't just about external victories. It's about internal change. What areas of your life need a deeper, more lasting transformation, rather than just surface-level adjustments? The story of Gideon's era also speaks to the nature of legacy. Gideon had accomplished great things, but the impact didn't last beyond his lifetime. This is a challenge for all of us to think about. What kind of legacy are we building, and will it last after we're gone? Gideon's leadership brought temporary peace, but what if his focus had been on cultivating a deeper spiritual foundation for the people? How would Israel's history have been different if the changes Gideon initiated had taken root in the people's hearts, not just their circumstances? In your own life, what can you do to ensure that the changes you're making are long-lasting? There's also a sobering lesson here about the importance of mentorship and succession. Gideon didn't appoint a successor or raise up new leaders to continue the work he had started. As a result, Israel was left without strong guidance after his death, and they quickly fell into disarray. This highlights the importance of investing in the next generation of leaders, both in our personal lives and in our communities. Who are you mentoring or investing in to ensure that the progress you've made continues after you're gone? Gideon's story also reminds us that leadership is about more than just winning battles. It's about preparing people for what comes next. Gideon was an incredible leader in times of crisis, but he didn't fully equip Israel to sustain their spiritual health after the crisis had passed. This is a challenge for all of us. It's not enough to lead well in the moment. We need to think about how to build systems, relationships, and habits that will sustain progress in the long term. What steps can you take today to ensure that the progress you're making isn't just temporary? The fall of Israel after Gideon's death also illustrates the dangers of relying too heavily on one leader. The people of Israel looked to Gideon as their guide, but when he was gone, they were lost. This shows us the importance of building a relationship with God that is personal and not dependent on any one person. Leaders come and go, but our connection to God should remain constant. In your own life, are there people or things you're relying on too much, rather than cultivating your own personal relationship with God or your own strength? Gideon's death leaves us with the question of sustainability. He had achieved incredible things, but the impact didn't last. It's a reminder that success isn't just about achieving a goal. It's about maintaining and building on that success over time. We often celebrate victories without thinking about what comes next, but Gideon's story challenges us to consider the long-term impact of our actions. How can you ensure that the successes in your life aren't just fleeting, but have lasting value? Finally, Gideon's story ends with a reminder that spiritual vigilance is necessary at all times. The people of Israel quickly forgot about God's role in their deliverance and fell back into idolatry. This reflects a truth we all experience. When we become complacent, we're more likely to fall into old habits. Gideon's story challenges us to stay spiritually alert, always mindful of the things that can pull us away from our purpose. What areas of your life need more vigilance to prevent a return to old, unhelpful patterns? As Gideon's era came to a close, Israel's future seemed uncertain. Without strong leadership, they were vulnerable to the same dangers that had plagued them before. The question remained: would Israel learn from their past mistakes, or would they fall into the same cycles of disobedience? So, what's holding you back from achieving your own victories? Gideon's story isn't just about a battle fought thousands of years ago. It's about overcoming the obstacles that stand between you and the life you were meant to live. Whether it's fear, doubt, or the feeling that you're not enough, the lessons of Gideon's journey show us that it's not about how strong or capable we are, but about trusting in something greater. Now, it's time to ask yourself, are you ready to step out of hiding and face your own Midianite army? The truth is, we all face battles that seem impossible to win. But if Gideon, a man full of fear and doubt, could defeat an army with just 300 men, what could you achieve if you leaned into faith and courage? What's the one step you can take today to start your own journey toward victory? And remember, you don't have to do it alone. If this story inspired you, if it lit a spark in your heart, then you're in the right place. Let's keep growing together. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notifications so you don't miss out on the powerful stories and lessons that will help you face your battles and come out victorious. What's your next move? The journey is just beginning.